Hi, everybody. I guess we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. I want to, on behalf of Microsoft and the other organizers of the event, just welcome you all to this webinar, to this panel, and thank you for joining. It's an important conversation about anti-Asian hate and discrimination. As we're winding down Asian Pacific American Heritage Month amidst the various celebrations and events of May, I do think it's fitting that we look ahead with clear eyes to the challenges that still face the AA and HPI community. We all know, I think, that anti-Asian hate, it's not a recent phenomenon. It's not a new thing for discrimination and violence to affect Asians in America. And certainly the perception of our community as perpetual foreigners has really persisted throughout our nation's history. But I think we can also be optimistic about the fact that our community is more organized, it's more galvanized, and frankly, more equipped than ever before to address these challenges. And I want to say the leaders on today's panel are really a testament to that. Some of them I've known for decades, whether they'll admit it or not. I've seen the ways in which folks are really taking action and really leading the charge in trying to address this. So we, at Microsoft, we're really proud to partner with Verizon. We're proud to partner with the organizations represented here to raise awareness about the issue, but more importantly, to really discuss what actions we can all be taking individually, collectively, as organizations, as companies, as ERGs, to address anti-Asian hate, whether it's in our workplace or whether it's in the broader community. And especially with the increasing rhetoric around our relations, our national relations with China, I think it's really important that we're having this conversation to really surface some of what we're seeing, what we're hearing, what we're feeling. So I look forward to hearing from the folks on the panel. I look forward to hearing about what action steps we can all be taking. And I, again, want to really thank everybody for joining in this conversation. It's important that you're here. It's important that you're participating. We look forward to your questions, and we look forward to continuing to work together. So thank you, and I'll turn it over, I think, to Emilio.
Thank you, Chen. Well, welcome and thank you as we close out Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Month with what I think will be a insightful, timely, relevant conversation. I do want to say thank you to Microsoft and to our employee resource group at Verizon, PACE, for all their support and helping pull this together. If there was a panel that really needed no moderator, this would be it. Today, we have three outstanding Asian American leaders who are at the forefront of advocacy, policy, and media. They are Christine Chen, the executive director and co-founder of APIAVote, the nation's leading nonpartisan organization dedicated to engaging, educating, and empowering the AAPI community. John Yang is president and executive director of Advancing Justice-AAJC, whose mission is to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and build a more fair and equitable society for all. And finally, Marian Chia-Ming Leo is vice president of civic engagement at the Asian American Journalists Association and project editor of special newsroom initiatives and partnerships at the Washington Post. Welcome. I'm going to ask each of you for a brief opening statement and then a series of questions to the three of you, knowing that it will be insightful what we gather back from you and your years of experience. So let's start off with you, Christine.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for hosting this forum. And for APIAVote, I think when we saw the rise of anti-Asian violence occurring, actually, even starting back in 2020, we also recognize that this is an issue that is not new to our community. And for us to really be able to address anti-Asian hate and the rise of that and the conditions that create the opportunities for these things to happen, we also know and believe that also has to deal about how the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities need to also build political power to be able to address this issue long term. I know early on, we're of course trying to make sure that we were tending to the needs of the victims and those that were impacted immediately. And now I know there's been a lot of discussions about, how can we advocate for more mental health services that are culturally relevant, or perhaps advocate for Asian American or ethnic studies in our K-12 education. But that ultimately is also about having a discussion and advocating with our elected officials about the resources and the need for these type of policy changes and for these programs to actually be enacted. And so for APIAVote, we're the nation's leading civil rights civic engagement organization focusing on building political power, really focusing on increasing voter participation rate of our communities. We do that by working with local nonprofit partners in 29 states, really to change our culture of as how our community looks at civic participation. That's everything from getting out the count for census, getting out the vote on every single election cycle, not once every 4 years or once every 2 years, but every single election, including local elections that are happening this year. Getting involved with redistricting, but then also encouraging individuals like all of you here today about perhaps running for office or joining a border commission. We do this really by empowering and resourcing and building the capacity of our local nonprofits to do this work. In addition, we also work with local college students on different campuses across the country to enact similar programs to get involved in that way. And APIAVote is also about changing the narrative through our research and communications apparatus. It is about making sure that political parties and the media understand what are the issues that the API electorate cares about and why it's important to engage with this particular community that's growing in size. And it is really the electorate that is making a difference in all these key races that we're seeing that are being won by very small margins in itself. So with that, I really look forward to this conversation, and I'll go ahead and turn it over, I think, to John.
Great. Thank you very much, Christine. And let me thank Emilio at Verizon and Chen at Microsoft for having us engage in this conversation. So I'm John Yang. I'm the Executive Director of Advancing Justice AAJC, based here in Washington, D.C. In terms of our organization, I think about it in 3 buckets. 1 is advocacy, 2 is education, and 3 is empowerment. So on the advocacy front, we're a DC organization. So we think about policies that affect the Asian American community, working with the administration, working with Congress about what policies will help our community. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the future. I think about litigation, how we use our advocacy tools in court as needed to help our community. Then I think about education, making sure that both our community themselves are educated about the issues, and then working with people like Marian in the media to make sure that we're telling the right stories about the Asian American community, using the right words about the Asian American community. And then it's about empowerment, making sure that our community themselves have the tools to do what needs to be done to effectuate change. And whether that is through lifting up grassroots organizations, developing infrastructure or the like, making sure that they know how they can help themselves to empower themselves to make that change. With respect to anti-Asian hate, certainly number 1 is our organization. In part, one of the first reports we did back in the early 1990s was what we call the hate crimes audit. So unfortunately, this is nothing new to our community. And we know this from post 9/11 experiences. We know this from many different contexts. And so when this happened in early 2020, the framework that I thought about was, how do we bring awareness to this issue? How do we respond to this issue? And how do we try to prevent this issue in the future? And again, we'll talk about these components as we go on, but I think that's what should continue to motivate all of us, and I include all of you that are watching this, in this work to think about how you might put yourselves into each of these spaces to help move all of our work forward. And with that, let me turn it over to Marian.
Thanks so much, John. So it's very much an honor to be on this panel and to speak on this subject. The reason I got into journalism is because our community, the AAPI community, does not speak out even if it's good and it's frustrating. And I wanted to be seen and help others like me to also be seen. Because growing up, I didn't see people like me reflected on TV, movies, leadership, or in the media. And I wanted to be that change by getting our news out about our communities. So the role of media is especially important. I was project editor for the Washington Post coverage on January 6th, and our stories were used in the hearings. And I've been a part of the Asian American Journalists Association, AAJA, since high school, because it's important for us to reflect our community in the media, to report what's going on. And I consider this group of journalists not only my family, but my sanctuary. And again, it's an honor to be here and talk about this issue because it's especially a heartbreak for all of us. And I want to make sure we are heard. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And let's get started. John, I'll start with you and then turn it over to folks here. But how do you see anti-Asian hate, discrimination today? What's changed from a few years ago, if anything? And as Chen mentioned, I'd like to add, what kind of knock-on effect have the current tensions between U.S.-China relationships having on the community?
Thanks for that question. Certainly, I sometimes think of COVID-19 as being a spark to our current wave of anti-Asian hate, but it is only a spark, and there are different things that have added fuel to that fire. Obviously, the naming of COVID-19 initially, when some people chose to call it the China virus or the Wuhan flu, really caused this hate that we saw. And I remember actually, this is probably January of 2020, Marian and I had probably had our first conversation talking about this issue and the backlash that we expect to see in our community. And to the credit of the journalists, AAJA and many others, they got it right initially, right, in terms of making sure that they called it COVID-19, the coronavirus, and called out and recognized that it was racist, it was potentially stigmatizing to refer to it as anything but those scientific terms. But the reality is that there is fuel being added onto the fire right now with respect to our ongoing tensions with the Chinese government. And what do I mean by that? Look, we do have real disagreements with the Chinese government. They are around whether it's the Uyghur Muslim minority in Xinjiang, whether it's democracy in Hong Kong, whether it is free speech. You know, there are many things that the Chinese government, and specifically Xi Jinping in his rule under his regime, have caused to have hardship for the entire world in certain ways. But even as we talk about that, you notice that I always talk about it in terms of the Chinese government or Xi Jinping, because what we do not want to do is generalize to say that this is a Chinese problem, or as FBI Director Wray once said, an all of society problem. Because once you use terms like that, we will see that backlash against the Asian American community. And we have history to judge us for that. Whether you think about World War II, when we had the incarceration of Americans of Japanese descent because of the Japanese Empire, whether we had the persecution and literally murder of Sikh Americans and Muslim Americans after 9/11 because of terrorist attacks in New York and here in Washington, D.C. Again, those were real events, and we do need to deal with those real events. But even as we do that, we need to make that distinction. We need to use the proper terms, adopt the proper policies that will make sure that we separate foreign relations and those true national security threats, as opposed to stigmatizing issues, politicizing issues that will cause harm to our Asian American community.
Yeah, you know, and jumping in here for APIAVote, our big concern is that as we head into the 2024 presidential election cycle, the different candidates are going to want to differentiate themselves and try to one-up each other. And we're really worried about the language that they're using. So it's not only the language that we're starting to see emerge from the U.S. Capitol as these issues are being discussed, but what happens on the campaign trail in itself. So there is a role I think that we need to play right now to start to push back, to have meetings with our elected officials and our political parties, and to hold them accountable now as a reminder, and to educate them and to really appeal to them about and provide them with some alternative language and solutions on how they could be framing this this whole discussion. And with that, it really is about getting involved now in hopes that we'll be able to change that as we move forward. Because the last thing that we want to do is to have it so be intensified where we're going to have things like that happened with Vincent Chen during the 80s time period, and I would imagine it even getting worse in terms of the number of incidences that could actually happen with this election rhetoric.
And then if I could add, just because you don't see it in the headlines doesn't mean it stopped. And just because there was a reported surge during the pandemic doesn't mean there hasn't always been an undercurrent of racism for the generations of our community here as Americans. In 2021, Pew found that 1/3 of Asian Americans feel threats, physical attacks, and violence. 1/3 of Asian Americans said that they changed their daily behavior to keep safe. More recently, according to API data, 1 in 4 Asian Americans have experienced a hate incident, while more than 2/3 have been asked where they're really from. I'm sure many of us on this panel have been asked that even recently. And then Stop API Hate self-reported from the community, almost 11,500 incidents have happened in the past 2 years. And then back when me and John were talking about how things were getting really bad, there was a woman who was in her 30s. She was so ashamed of being Asian. She wanted to change her face. That's how bad it can get. And even after the spa shooting, I interviewed an Atlanta Korean mom, and she had to have that talk that so many African-American parents are used to having about staying safe with her daughter. And all these sources, when I interviewed them, they talked not only about arming themselves with personal alarms, but they warned me and sent me links to buy those same alarms for myself and for my elderly parents. And even a year after the shooting, Congresswoman Meng, who has been very outspoken about our community and staying safe, she was scared to go outside. And she made a point to cover her Black hair, so to hide the fact that she's Asian. I'm still scared. I'm scared of the looks. I'm scared of the whispers. It's not great feeling at all. So grateful that we can talk about this and bring it to light.
Thank you, Marian.
I would also add one more thing is, like, I think the whole idea that we're constantly seen as the foreigner. And so when you have this rhetoric between US, China come up, the natural tendency many times is to go to that narrative that the Asian community that you're seeing is this foreign entity, when in reality, that that's not the case. But also, I think there's a role that we could be playing with our allies to immediately start talking with our friends and colleagues and those in the workplace about what we're experiencing. How is the US-China rhetoric even now impacting our lives? So then, because I know one of the things that happened post the Atlanta shootings, a lot of those who are outside the Asian community were really quite surprised to hear about the experiences that we had with anti-Asian hate and racism, because they were not necessarily hearing that. So I think it's really important and crucial for us to also talk about what we're feeling and experiencing right now.
Thanks, Christine. No doubt that words matter. Words have consequences. Starting with you, Christine, what are some recent policies that have helped or harmed the community as they relate to anti-Asian hate? And what are some ongoing efforts to combat these negative issues?
So I will focus on a couple of policy issues that's, once again, more focusing on voting that is related to us building political power as we address anti-Asian hate. So, before 2020, I used to say half of our family and friends that are eligible are ready to cast their ballot and are registered and ready to go vote. The other half are not. Luckily in 2020, I think our community woke up. They understood because of decisions that are being made by elected officials at the local, state, and federal level, that they understood that decisions of these elected officials and government were impacting their livelihoods, and the importance of who gets elected really can play into what happens with their own lives, right? And so as a result, we saw one of the largest increase of voter participation among all different ethnic communities. We increased to 60% of our community finally registering and voting. And so it was really exciting to see this and for it to replicate this increase in the 2022 midterm elections. One of the things that we saw during the last 3 years is that early voting and mail-in ballots is the most preferred way of voting for our community. And one of the beliefs that why we were able to increase our participation is because a large bulk of the states were able to enact early voting and mail-in ballots, and to make it a lot easier for us to access those means to be able to vote early. And so we have seen that continue rise, which has allowed us to actually get the recognition among elected officials. And then after Election Day, once again, when we're advocating on policy issues as is related to combating anti-Asian hate, we're able to do that more effectively. At the same time, we know that in states like in Georgia and in Texas, where they're making it harder for you to be able to be eligible for mail-in ballots, or they're cutting the locations for early voting, we know that there's also a decrease of voter participation in terms of early voting from our communities in those particular states in itself.
In terms of policy, certainly, if you think about legislation, if you will, certainly the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act was helpful because that allows for, among other things, better data around hate crimes and hate incidents. It allows for greater resources to be given to communities to address hate and address violence against our communities. Then you think about what some states have done. California, notably, has devoted a number of resources to that. And again, the key here, the resources are not just for law enforcement, but for mental health, but for recovery, but for all sorts of a myriad of different possibilities for addressing all of these different aspects of hate. I think the other thing I would point out, although it is not a policy per se with respect to legislation, is what a lot of ERGs have done and a lot of companies have done. And here I will single out Verizon. Verizon has done a wonderful job in 2021 with respect to responding to our community's needs, and literally giving several $1 million to our community to help sort of provide for that recovery, provide for that awareness, provide for that prevention. So those are pieces that would be helpful. And frankly, a lot of that was driven by all of you in employee resource groups. Like what we saw, and this frankly started, and this is where solidarity is important. After George Floyd in 2020, we saw employee resource groups take a different character. And this was driven in many ways by the African American community, but then augmented by our Asian American community and Latino American community, because we all were experiencing the same thing. And once everyone started speaking together and speaking to their company's leadership, what we saw were more statements by companies, more resources that were being devoted by companies to all of these issues. So again, where I really want to push all of you that are watching this is that the power is actually in your hands to help drive some of this. If you think about the policies that are enacted even in state and federal government, it's because the members of Congress, state legislators are hearing from all of you that this is something that is needed. Obviously, we could give you all talking points about how you could frame that, whether it's to legislators or frankly, even to your company's leadership, if that might be helpful. But what I really want to impart in all of you is that the power that all of you hold.
I also want to flag some bills that have recently come out, both Texas and Florida banning Chinese nationals from buying land. There are so many immigrants who came before us that sought the American dream to build these businesses, but so many during this pandemic racism lost their restaurants and businesses. And now you see all these ethnic enclaves, the Chinatowns disappearing before our very eyes. And then to Christine's point from before, also, I mean, first of all, these bills are frustrating. And then there's a worry that folks can't tell the difference between a Chinese national and a Chinese American, and why we're perpetually known as, you know, foreigners. We can't pass. There's just no way. But there's also, encouragingly, there are also bills across the nation to mandate teaching of API history in schools. Florida just passed that. And the amazement and wonderment of finally seeing your community in history books is just wonderful. So there's ways of getting civically engaged that, you know, is beyond voting, showing up at these school hearings, rallying, making sure people know, and making sure all these bills for the education are grassroots efforts. And it's been beautiful to see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you want to go?
You know, I would say also, you know, the rallying, the organizing that's being done locally is engaging a new base of parts of the community that was never involved before. There are new immigrants. There are those who are young and old that are organizing against those Asian land laws, and as well as rallying for ethnic studies for K through 12 education. So I'm also seeing that post, you know, the Atlanta shootings, that there's a lot more organizing that's being done. There's new organizations that are being created, but then at the same time, there's also a knowledge and of understanding the traditional civil rights advocacy organizations, such as many of our groups, about how do you get involved with organization like ours, and how you can actually make sure that your family and friends are protected by your engagement and involvement.
Thank you, Christine. And keep the questions coming in. We will get to them towards the end here. All of you have mentioned 2020 as a watershed year. I want you to go back there and give us some perspective on how people organized then. What were some key lessons learned? Specifically, what were the effective strategies that you saw from the civic engagement, policy, and media side? And Marian, we'll start with you.
Thanks. Well, Christine and John both mentioned this, but I think it's important to remember we're not alone. Our community stood side by side with Black Americans on BLM, and they also came for us when we were hurting with all the anti-Asian hate. And like I mentioned before, we were present for state hearings, getting involved not only in voting, but also rallying to get our history into textbooks. And I think it's important to mention how much more mental health resources through all this. We're not reporting things. So of course we're not reporting our pain, seeing all the news headlines, repeated attacks on our elderly. There's so much more specific mental health services for Asians, like Asian Mental Health Collective, and how important it is to speak out when it hurts, to report out when something happens. There's just been so many more nonprofits and things Stop API Hate, you know, Very Asian Foundation. There's so many things that are out now because we're finally speaking out.
Yeah. A lot of this also is very organic, because number one is just recognizing that our community was growing and just to let some things develop. So literally it was crowdsourcing of documents to a certain level of trying to figure out, all right, here are all of the different resources that are available. Because our community in some ways is unlike the Latino community, the African-American community. We don't have a central resource, if you will. Part of it is, you know, we are a very, you know, heterogeneous community, you know, number of different languages, number of different ethnicities. And there's a beauty and strength in that. And so when we have issues like this, it's to make sure we have a way that we could connect with each other in a rapid way. So literally like crowdsourcing of documents, literally getting on Zoom calls and conference calls together to just kind of really sort of organically talk about these issues, recognizing that all of us have different lanes. There was definitely a feeling that it's like, you know, we shouldn't be in competition with each other. And I will name that directly. There are times that people get worried that we are competing with each other, whether it's for resources and the like, and recognize that our community is so small that there are more than enough needs to go around. And that if we are just being coordinated and choosing different lanes, that is going to be helpful. So I think that was definitely successful or helpful. Marian hit it on the head in terms of the solidarity piece, is just how our African-American, Latino American, LGBTQ American brothers and sisters and everyone really came together because we were fighting this common thread of racism, this common thread of white supremacy, and to make sure that we understand that through line and that we are talking about it in that common way was exceptionally helpful. So those are certainly the pieces that I would name in terms of what happened during that time that was successful and really helped to move the needle forward quickly.
You know, I think leading into the 2020 cycle, when reflecting back, especially since a number of us, as Chen had noted, a number of us have known each other for 25, 30 years. You know, when I first started my career, I would say there was only 3 or 4 national API civil rights advocacy organizations. They were only representing maybe the Chinese and Japanese communities. The numbers were not there in terms of if we didn't even have that many API elected officials or those in federal, state, or local government. So the infrastructure was very different. But heading into 2020, not only did we have the growth of our community come, and we saw that coming out from the 2020 census, where there's now acknowledgement that we increase in double digits in every single state except for Hawaii, where we're already a majority. And but also we knew heading into 2020, we had to get ready for the census and the presidential election. So that only happens once every 20 years. So I know a number of us, including AAJA and Asian American Advancing Justice, AAJC, and a whole coalition of groups were getting ready for the census, right? Trying to educate our communities, because not only have we grown in size, but we've also become more diverse. There were communities that were not around 10 years ago. So understanding and working within that infrastructure, getting them ready for the presidential primaries and the general elections. By starting early and working with the existing infrastructure, strengthening the local infrastructure, I think it allowed us and the local organizations to pivot a lot more effectively when they had to deal with anti-Asian hate, or when they had to deal with, you know, distribution of PPE, or dealing with other ramifications of the pandemic. So that's one thing I would like to reflect on and really hone in on, is that as we move forward, part of it is that our infrastructure is a lot more solid, it's well connected, it's more diverse, and there's a larger number of different organizations. But once again, it is about how we can effectively complement one another, as well as continue to work in coalition with other allies.
Thank you, Christine. Infrastructure is a great word in this context, and I want to ask the 3 of you, before we go to lots of questions coming in, great questions. What can individuals, members of employee resource groups, what can they do? You know, if you could pick one specific thing that they could contribute, and how can they get involved in helping you in these initiatives? John?
Actually, I'm not going to pick one thing. I would ask each of the ERGs to pick one thing and not let sort of indecisiveness or the fear of trying to do too little stop you. Because oftentimes I think the ERG is like, well, what can we do? I mean, even if you do, I know a number of the groups that are represented here, corporate groups that are represented here, did bystander intervention training. That is a great example of something small, quote unquote, small that you can do that is empowering for a community. Even if coming together to do a fundraiser for a group, that is empowering for a community. Even if it's just individually thinking about, okay, a group of us will band together and get Asian American history to be taught one day. We're not even talking about legislation, not even talking about changing the school board, going to their respective teachers and say, hey, it's Asian American History Month. Can we just teach something on Asian American history? Those are all things that would be helpful to move the needle. And then the last thing I would say is, how do you work with your respective ERGs, whether it's in the LGBTQ, Latino, African American, Native American communities, to come up with a project together to show solidarity. So I don't want to proscribe one thing for all of you. I would want all of you to think about, given the ecosystem that you're in, what would most inspire you, and just go out and do it.
I would add, I think it is important to start with ourselves. I think it's important to be proud of who we are and love who we are and appreciate who we are. I think there's so much of an immigrant mentality to duck down and not want to stick out. There's that saying that you don't want to be the nail that sticks out, otherwise you'll be hammered down. And that's why there's so much like not reporting of attacks. And I know for me, after covering so much of these attacks and talking to victims and legislators, I was also afraid. And it took me, like, at the height of it all, I went to this Vietnamese restaurant hoping to honor and celebrate the community, and then witnessed a racist incident. And instead of doing anything, I ran out because I was in Florida and people are packing, and who knows what might be happening if they would turn on us next, because we were the only other Asians in the room besides the restaurant workers. And my husband glared at the man who was making fun of people's accents, and until he shut up, and then caught up with me outside the restaurant after I ran out and said, we need to stand up and be proud of who we are. And I had never used my Chinese name in anything. My husband doesn't even use it, and decided that it was important for me to include it in my byline to represent fully who I am. And that's a common struggle that not just non-Asians have, so many of us with non-common names, just trying to buy a coffee at Starbucks, because we cannot feel like we can be fully ourselves. And I think it's important to be yourself fully, an AAPI member of the community, and to reflect that and to show that, and that we're proud of that.
And I lean into that. It's like one of the things I always appreciate about what Marian is talking about is the humanity in all of us, and making sure that we celebrate each of our individual humanities. So if you look at my byline now, when my emails, actually I do have my Chinese name, and that's actually because of Marian and an article that she wrote. And so it is that power that all of us share with each other, the humanity that all of us share with each other, that I think is just also energizing in these times when we get down on ourselves and down on sort of how much of a struggle our community has. So I just want to really +1 what she's saying.
So, I would also want to have everyone focus on, what is it that you could do as an individual? What can you do among your family and friends? And then also, what can you do collectively among your ERG and your greater, ecosystem or family at your workplace, right? Re-emphasizing what John and Marian is saying, it really is about choosing what issue or what drives your passion. I think that's what allows each and every one to continue going on and doing this work, because it is about honing in on what is that passion, and then really narrowing it down, like I said, what you can do individually, collectively, with your family and friends, and then as a ERG in itself. It's also, what can you do year round? Thinking about how you could be engaged at different points throughout the year, and not necessarily just thinking it's May or it's election season. What are those little things that you could continue to do throughout the year? And then, ultimately, all of our organizations here are plugged into a larger ecosystem of AANHPI national and local organizations. We can definitely connect you up with local partners. And also, there are so many different volunteer opportunities. But once again, it really, how can we make sure that it's aligned with your values and with your interests and passion? But I will also pivot a little bit, that I do want to flag that as we head into 2024, but even before that, I think we saw quite a bit of this, even starting back in 2016. is the whole issue about mis and disinformation and media literacy. Especially with technology and AI, there's going to be a lot of more concerns of like, what do we need to do? Once again, individually to educate ourselves so that way we don't fall into those traps. What can we do with our family and friends to make sure that they're getting the correct information and that we're also pushing out and uplifting content that is actually correct. But then also as an organization or a corporation, you know, what can we be doing to push back on that as well?
And off Christine's point, it's about what language do we use to describe our communities and what is okay and what is not. I'm leading an effort with AAJA to figure out a style guide. Like, what does API even mean? What do all these labels mean? Is HOPA okay? Is mixed okay? What are pop culture terms? When is appropriation okay? What are the terms do we use to describe ourselves? And we're trying to figure out a guide to set a standard so people outside our community can use language that's comfortable and relatable for us.
You may have just answered the first question, which was about how to use the right terms and get them known to the general public. And those are great suggestions. I listening to the three of you, it's clear, to borrow the old proverb, the longest journey begins with the first step, and it need not be a giant step. I'm going to turn over to questions now. We have quite a few of them. And one of the first ones is, do any of you have any thoughts about an AAPI community formally issuing a travel advisory around Florida, Texas, as was done by NAACP with Florida? Jump right in.
We've actually debated about it at AAJC, and it's an interesting question. I think for us, we recognize that we have large AAPI communities there as well. So it's working with our local communities to understand what would be most helpful to them, what would empower them to get the change that they need. Because even for the NAACP, they are very, very, very clear saying that, like, we're not saying that people should not travel there. We're just wanting people to understand all the things that are happening in Florida that are affecting our community. So I recognize that is, and I'm a lawyer, so it's a lawyer's non-answer. But I think the key here is to understand the issues, understand how our local community is feeling about the issues, and at the same time call out the policies that we see that are problematic.
I agree with John. I think it starts with the community. I think the NAACP, when they did it certainly raised media interest and it flagged the concern. But Florida, I guess, is a growing Asian American community, and I would want to check in with them. You don't want to, you want to make sure you fit the needs and not cause more controversy and make things worse, I would say. I think it's important to figure out what's right for the community.
Great point.
And for us, you know, we're still traveling to those states because we're there to help organize the community and try to make sure that they're actually being supported as they're trying to fight back in coalitions on a lot of these bad policies.
Here's a question some of you have touched on today. With so many you name it, bills, how can we also act intersectionally to support communities impacted? AAPI, LGBTQ, African American, others.
For me, from the legislative perspective, is making sure that we have those touch points, right? Is like, it is not enough for me, for example, that we get Asian American history in schools. Rather, we only do that in combination that making sure that African American history is taught in schools, that LGBTQ history is taught in schools, and making sure that we are making those connections with those organizations, those communities. So in terms of solidarity, that's where it starts, is making sure both at a local level for our local organizations, and then for me as a national organization, that I'm touching base with the Urban League, the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, MALDEF, to make sure we have those we have an aligned strategy, if you will, or at least we have those discussions. And maybe that we will disagree on certain pieces, and that's okay, but we have to develop the trust, because bottom line, bottom line on all of this is we are all fighting the same enemy. If I was to use the word enemy, which I probably should be careful about doing, but that this notion of white supremacy is real, and we do need to name that. And if we name that, then that informs how we all work together.
Great point.
And, you know, re-emphasizing that relationship needs to start early on, not only during a crisis time period. So it's really important for us to begin those relationships and to have many times, even to start out with dialogue and understanding, like, what are the misconceptions that we may have when, you know, especially when you're trying to build a diverse coalition. Once again, if we build a solid coalition, then, you know, if there's different legislations that are being introduced at different times, then collectively you're going to be a lot more effective when different voices are chiming in for different communities, but we're all acting as one entity in full force.
And I think it's important to remember that the AAPI community too is very diverse. That's why there's so many letters. Many of us on this panel are probably more East Asian, but it's important to remember they're South Asian, Pacific Islander, and that we all are not the same at all. We have different journeys.
Another good question here: how can and should the community address landmark efforts to pass AAPI history in school, while these are in direct parallel with efforts to stop Black American history from being taught that are being painted as woke or critical race theory and the 1619 Project? Any thoughts around that?
I think this is where, and I alluded to this, is that we shouldn't celebrate Asian American history if it is coming at the cost of African American history, coming at the cost of LGBTQ history. Because the reality is that there are certain people that are trying to use us as a wedge. There are certain people that are trying to play us into that model minority stereotype. You know, this notion of, well, we're not racist because look what we did for the Asian American community. Let's get real about that. And so we need to be careful about that. Yes, we should celebrate the fact that sort of we want to make progress in seeing our individuals reflected in the in sort of our lived experiences. But again, this is where it's also very, very important to be in connection with these other communities, so that sort of these other communities know what we stand for, so that when these things get passed, right, and I will name Florida as one example, that these communities understand that we don't think that that's enough, is sort of that we are not going to be a political wedge, that we are going to continue to fight for LGBTQ rights. We are going to continue to fight for African-American AP studies, and that sort of this legislation, the fact that it's trying to divide us, will not do so. Others?
Plenty of questions here. This is a very interesting question, and I think so because as you all know, we live in a data-driven world. And the question is, what are some of the metrics to measure progress towards equality? Do you think, Christine, is it the number of voters or participation in the census, or seeing fewer bills that are anti, you name it?
Yeah, so I will go ahead and, since I am APIAVote, I will focus a little bit about how we are looking at making sure our community is voting at parity with other communities. So what we look at when we look at the census data, we're also looking at the number of citizen voting age populations and what is the rate of them registering, voting on a regular basis. So many times we know that we're not pulling our weight if we're going to be working in coalition and going to be as effective in doing our advocacy work, we're only able to do that if our community is also registering and voting and participating at the same rate as other communities and within our allies. And so that's why we've been really focusing on how do we reach that number. Even though I said in 2020, we were able to increase participation by 10 percentages, but we still have a long way to go to continue to reach that 70 or 80%, right? And so that's how we look at data. But it's also about how do we look at how many organizations are incorporating and changing the culture of how they look at civic engagement? Are they embedding this work into their day-to-day activities? So it's not just once every 4 years or once every 2 years, or it's not only just like during November, but perhaps they're also participating in the primaries. And so it is also about going back to that infrastructure, whether or not we're doing this year round, and also are we resourcing these organizations to be able to be full-fledged, powerful organizations. And we know that a lot of these nonprofits are not well resourced. Many times they're all volunteer driven, or they're just now transitioning where they received some funding. But we also know that less than 1% of all corporate giving is given to AAPI organizations, and less than 0.5% of foundation dollars. So there's still a lot of work that still needs to be done, and when you really look at the data and what needs to be done. Oh, I think you're on mute.
That's not good for a moderator. Marian, anything on your end?
I was trying to figure out how to answer this. I mean, on one hand, I could facetiously say when there's no more stories to write, but I think we are at we finally have a Marvel superhero, right? There's finally like sitcoms that, we have these nonprofits, we have these organizations, but it's hard to say. I mean, we're also 10 generations plus deep in the US, and we're still talking about this, and we're still talking about how do we even find a voice? How do we stand up for each other? How do we even band with other groups? So I think it's a really hard thing to measure, and I think it's still a very long road to go.
John, any thoughts, comments?
Yeah, there's both data and its stories, right? There's data that we could point to, whether it is even in the context of corporations, how many people are at the entry level versus middle management versus C-suite. Like, we could use that data and then disaggregate that data to make sure we're understanding that, like Marian said, we're all East Asian. I think we're all Chinese, maybe Taiwanese American here on this panel. So that's not representative of the Asian American community. So there's data that you can pull apart, even making sure you have data on the Asian American community. As we all know, when you look at polls and surveys, half the time we're not even included on those. But then to Marian's point, it's the stories. It's like, how many times are Asian American reporters asked to just report on Asian American issues versus mainstream issues? The fact that Marian was the one that was doing the January 6th insurrection, that speaks to me about equity, right? That she's not getting slotted to a particular role within media. It's like she can do, as we all know we can, mainstream issues. So there's those stories or those anecdotes that I think we all can sort of know it when we see it as to whether we are starting to achieve that equity.
Final question here, and I'm not going to read the whole question, but the gist of it. How can schools do a better job of teaching diversity and getting younger folks to embrace it in the classroom?
I think it starts with the teachers and representation, and then it goes up to leadership, people making the decision, the principals, the legislators. But you want at the very level teachers that look like the students. And we all know that it's hard as Asians to do those non-technical fields. You have to fight your families first to get that. So it's being represented on every level, and it's breaking that. I know a lot of people call it the bamboo ceiling, so that we're not only reflective, but we're also making the leadership decisions.
It's interesting because someone just wrote in that the point about not getting slotted into traditional Asian jobs is spot on. So I think your points are just right on there.
It's also about not just celebrating or incorporating and talking about Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders only in May. How can it really be celebrated and this, discussions and education about our lived experience and history really embedded with other communities, Can we have more discussions about what are the commonalities and experiences that we're all facing? Where are all the challenges that we're all facing? But how does that manifest in different ways and show up within our communities, right? And so having those kind of conversations and teaching those type of, being taught to think critically in that manner and to have those kind of discussions. I don't think we're having those type of discussions and intersectional conversations as often as we should be.
The last thing I would say is diversity should not be seen as a threat. Being different should not be treated as being something that is negative. And that, unfortunately, is what we are seeing too much of right now. That this notion that we all need to be the same is, to me, ludicrous. We need to be different. In fact, that's how we grow as a nation. That's how we innovate. That's how we maintain sort of the vibrant society that we have. And part of that diversity includes race. Part of that diversity includes culture. And so we should talk about it. We could talk about those strengths. Yes, we can also talk about where those produce weaknesses too. But the fact that we are comfortable talking about it, speaking the truth to that, is what we need to make sure that educators, school systems, the entire society gets around. This notion of being anti-woke or anti-diversity is just frustrating, I think, for all of us, because it's just contrary to what lived reality is. This notion that we are different and we should celebrate that, and that's what makes us stronger.
Thank you. And as we close out here today, as the parent of 2 Asian American daughters, I want to thank the 3 of you for your insights, your passion, and your lifetime commitment to this. So thank you so much. I'm going to introduce Priya Desani from National Grid, who's going to wrap us up for the day. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Emilio. Good afternoon, everyone. As Emilio said, my name is Priya Desani from National Grid. We wanted to thank all of you for attending today. Thank you to Microsoft for sponsoring the event, to Verizon for moderating the event, to APIAVote, and to the AAJA for being our panelists today. One quick thing we wanted to mention, the way this session came together today was through the Asian Affinity Roundtable. It started back in 2009 with 5 employees meeting at a conference and saying, how do you get your employees engaged in employee resource group initiatives? How do you keep them, entertained and wanting more? So we start off with 5 employees in 2009, 5 companies, and now we're up to over 150 companies. So we've collaborated on events over the years, and this event was possible by all the wonderful companies today participating. And we really encourage you to take this back. We hope you found it useful. Take it back to your companies, take it back to your employee resource groups, and continue the conversations there. And also look out for more collaborations through the Asian Affinity Roundtable. We look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you for joining.